Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Pippa Bailey, and I'm head of our climate change and sustainability practice at Ipsos. And I'm very excited to be talking to you today about sustainability. And it's an incredibly important topic. So we're going to cover quite a lot of material, and I look forward to the questions that you may have after we finish. So let's start with, what do we mean when we talk about sustainability? If you ask most people, they will say it's about the environment, it's about climate change, it's about pollution, it's about plastics in our oceans, it's about deforestation, it's about polluted waterways, degradation of soil and deforestation. All of these things immediately jump to mind. And, that is a major factor. It's very present in people's minds. But it's really only half of the story, because when at Ipsos we're talking about sustainability, we're also talking about us as global citizens, and we're talking about our sustainability as a race, because we're not sustainable if we're not protecting people, supporting them, educating them, nourishing them, providing the right amount of healthcare, ensuring that the old and those who are less able are looked after, that we're not discriminating between people because everyone has something to contribute. So all these factors are connected: the sustainability of the planet and the sustainability of us as a human race. They're intrinsically linked, and I will come back to this later. But I want to start my presentation with a conclusion, and it's something we'll come back to at the end of the presentation. But I wanted to put this up there because it's a little bit provocative. If your business isn't sustainable, it isn't sustainable. And this will make sense when I come to the end of the presentation, but I just want you to hold that thought as we go through. Now, I'm going to cover three main areas in my presentation. The first of these is to provide a kind of very macro view of the consumer context and concerns, and that does predominantly focus on the environment, and so we will start with that. We'll then move on to look at the consumer understanding. How much do consumers understand about what's going on and about sustainability? What are their behaviours, and what are their expectations of government and business to act? And then we'll come to a more commercial section in section 3, where we talk about the danger of sustainable silos. And this will make sense as we get there. So let's start off with consumer context and concern. We know that 83% of the global population think we're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And you can see in this chart a number of the countries that were included in this study. And you see a bit of a dip in 2019, and then this quite dramatic rise to 2020 and 2021 for a lot of the markets. And part of this is driven by the very extreme weather conditions that we've experienced over the last few years, driven by climate change, whether that be wildfires in the west coast of the US and in Australia, whether it be the amount and intensity of hurricanes that we've seen, particularly in the US, but in other parts of the world as well, flooding, extreme temperatures, also extreme snow in places that we wouldn't expect to see it. So very extreme weather conditions which have touched most people in some way across the globe, disrupting our lives. So that interplay again between the environment and our ability to be sustainable as individuals on the planet. And we know that the climate emergency from our global trend survey is the #1 value that unites the planet. And that's across a number of topics, looking at education, healthcare, politics, you name it. It is very much front and center for the global citizen. And when we look at this in terms of other concerns that people have, so things like the cost of living, corruption, schooling, taxes, we see that environment overall comes in at #5. This has moved up compared to last year, so it's overtaken unemployment. But what we see is that we as individuals are very much concerned with what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, what's happening next week. We're worried about our children, we're worried about our relatives, we're worried about our friends, how secure our jobs are. And these things will always remain primary in people's lives. So what's happening now? The environment, yes, people are very conscious about what we need to do, that we need to act. But sometimes these things are not so present in our day-to-day lives because they feel a little bit more remote, a little bit more far off. So it's likely that healthcare, protecting our loved ones, protecting our jobs, having a safe place to live, and our worry about coronavirus, obviously, which continues to impact people across the globe, are primary in this list. But when we ask people from the list what worries them most, and we see that environment is up there, we see that it's particularly the LATAM countries. So we see here Colombia, Brazil, and Chile that are very much at the top. So they are more concerned than many. And we know that overall that people are as worried about COVID as they are about the environment. But this worry about the environment is so extreme that we see that 50% of people think that priority should be given to the environment over the economy. So 50% think that the environment and focus should come first, and only 35% thinking that economic development, and this covers both developed and emerging countries. So that's really important to point out. Again, when we look at this, we see that the LATAM countries, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Brazil are at the top of this list. And let's have a little think about probably why that is. You know, you're citizens yourself. And that's because people in South America have noticed the effects of climate change more than any other region in the globe. When we look here, 61% versus 36% for the global average. And that's because the effects of climate change are being readily felt in LATAM regions. But when we now turn to look at who is affected, is it all generations? Is it young people? Is it old people? We actually see that everybody's worried about the environment. You can see at the top, more than 70%, irrespective of the age cohort that people are in across the globe. But young people are more angry, and so they should be. It's the actions of generations that have come prior to them that have affected the situation that we now find ourselves in. And it's their future, their children, their grandchildren, the planet in which they're going to live. But we also see that they can be a little bit indifferent, more so than other age cohorts. And again, there's a reason for this. We see that young people feel like they hear far more about negative impacts of the environment than they do about progress, so how science and technology will be able to help us. And that's because these young people, we're all connected to our mobile phones. Let's not pretend that we aren't, but they particularly are exposed to more news than perhaps prior generations would have been at the same age. And this creates an anxiety and a worry in their minds. And we know on social media, to which many young people are very involved, that bad news travels 5 times faster than good news. So they're going to be exposed to a lot of negativity. And hence, 1 in 5 young people, these are people under 35 years of age, are more fatalistic. They already think that it's too late to fix this. And this compares to only 1 in 10 of those aged over 50. And this is a dangerous place to be for the young. However, on a positive note, what we do see with the younger generations is that they're more likely to shout to have their voice heard. They're more likely to be voting with their feet, contributing to protests and petitions, and also potentially only directionally, but to be boycotting brands that they feel are not behaving in an appropriate manner towards the climate crisis. And this is shown very much in stark reality when we look at the trade-off between companies doing stuff to prevent harming the environment versus paying the correct amount of tax, so the governance of the company. And young people think that far more effort should be given to reducing harm to the environment than paying the right amount of tax. And you can see this particularly in Gen Z, which is the kind of youngest cohort, youngest group of coming adults that we would look at. So from our first section, we can see that climate is front and centre in the minds of the global citizen, and no more so than in the southern hemisphere, where people are affected most by climate change and they are experiencing it in their day-to-day lives. So much so that citizens really want business and government to prioritise the environment over other things, whether that be making money or paying the right amount of taxes. So let's move on to our second section of the presentation, and that's consumer understanding, behaviour and expectations. Now, the global citizens are saying we should be doing more. We're worried. Things are affecting us on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing the effect of climate change and we're seeing the effect of our abuse of the planet. But when we look at the behaviours that we as citizens can make, we see that there's been very little change over the last 7 years with regard to activities that we can take on a day-to-day basis, whether that be avoiding products which have too much packaging, switching off light bulbs, turning the temperature down, walking instead of taking a car. So often we hear that a lot of criticism is levelled at us, at consumers, because of this say-do gap. We say that we're worried, we say that we're concerned, we're saying that more should be done, but we're not doing much or more ourselves. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because it's much more complicated than that. There's a shared responsibility. In order for us to be able to make significant changes and progress, it's going to require, yes, citizens to do their part, but also government and companies. And it's the interplay between those things that are really important, because consumers will only act when there's a joined up narrative about what should be done between government and business. Also, knowledge is a challenge. We know this from the data that we look at, is that consumers misunderstand what needs to be done. They overestimate the things which actually will have a small impact and underestimate those which will have a larger impact. And also there's a paradox of choice. People are bombarded with messages and communication and labelling on what's the best thing to do. So knowing where they should start and what's going to have the best impact is really difficult for them. But something is clear, is that global citizens think that they're doing enough. So when we look at those people who should act versus those that are taking action, we see that there's an expectation that government and private companies should be doing more than they are. And most LATAM countries, interestingly, are actually more likely to fess up as global citizens, that they need to take action themselves. So if we look at the global average, it's 50, whereas we look at kind of Colombia, Mexico and Chile, it's much higher than this. And so, you know, the citizens of the LATAM countries are saying, yes, we need to do something, we need to do more ourselves. And they're putting increased onus on themselves for protecting the environment specifically. And it's because that environment is so important to the citizens of the LATAM countries, and that their success, their ability to thrive, is dependent on the environment. And the belief that lifestyle change is going to need to be significant. I think many consumers across the globe hope they can make some small changes, and the rest of it's up to government and business to sort it out. But actually, we see in the LATAM countries, they're much more likely to say that, yes, we recognise that we ourselves are going to have to make some notable differences to the way that we live our lives if we're going to be able to rescue the situation that we're in. Now, interestingly, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, 7 in 10 citizens globally think they know what actions they need to take, but do they? So when they were asked about, you know, what activities they can do, that they're taking part in, which they think will help the crisis, we can see that the top answer is recycling as much as possible and buying energy from renewable sources, you know, replacing a typical car with an electric car. But when we look at the carbon emissions, of these activities, we see that there's not a good relationship between the things that people are saying they can do and would do potentially, and the actual impact on the environment. In fact, recycling, yes, it's important that we're doing it so that that waste doesn't end up in inappropriate places like the ocean and dumped in other countries, but the impact is relatively small compared to some of the bigger actions that people are going to need to take, some choices, hard choices that people are going to have to make about their travel plans, about their holidays, about their diet, and so on. So there is a gap between what people think they should be doing and what they need to do, and that does need to be bridged. Now, we don't make it easy for consumers. Just in the UK alone, we have 87 eco-labels, and it's overwhelmingly confusing for the consumer. They don't have time to look at labels and make choices between, should I buy something that's made from recycled material, or is fully recyclable, or is decomposable? It's very complicated. So something needs to be done to make it easier for the consumer to help businesses, but also help themselves make the right choices. And there's a big desire to regulate. So there needs to be more regulation, and that's felt across the globe. So what we're hearing is that global citizens are giving the permission for government and business to act, to do things differently. And we already have quite things like the congestion charge, which has been applied in many cities across the globe. And people haven't risen up and said, we're not going to accept this, this is part of our liberty. And because people accept that they can enjoy their cities if they're less polluted, there's less traffic there, and people are not going to suffer from breathing difficulties. So people accept that there are benefits to be had from further regulation. So global citizens accept this. We need to do this to protect the environment and ourselves as citizens that live in these environments. But LATAM's interesting specifically because the citizens of LATAM know that they need to change their lifestyle themselves. So they're perhaps more willing, more ready to be engaged in making those lifestyle changes if we're going to improve things. I want to come to my final section where we're just going to narrow down a bit more into the kind of commercial reality and what we need to think about with regard to sustainability. A lot's talked about environment. I've started this presentation talking a lot about environment because this is the thing that often jumps to the consumer's mind or the layperson's mind when they're thinking about sustainability. But when we ask consumers across the globe, and again, this covers 28 countries across developed and emerging economies, about the importance of the environment versus social. So these are like treating employees fairly, diversity of working conditions, not discriminating, paying people fairly, and governance, which is good corporate practice like paying tax and executive remuneration. We actually see that there's a very close tie between protecting the environment and improving society. So coming back to the point that I made right at the beginning, we can only be sustainable if we're thinking about not only the environment, but also ourselves as global citizens and how we're looking after each other to exist and thrive in this world. And people have already made this link between the environment and social. And the pandemic has driven this. So you see this figure here, that 62% of people globally think that the pandemic is linked to our misuse of the environment. We're part of an ecosystem after all. We're not separate from the environment. That our misuse, mistreatment of the environment has kind of come back to bite us and to help to redress. But obviously, you will have heard in Delhi that there was a lockdown, not due to COVID, but because the pollution from power stations was so great that people couldn't breathe properly. So they had to shut schools and businesses and the power stations themselves. These things are intrinsically linked. So we can't think about environment, social and governance as silos. Commercially and strategically, we have to think about them together. And I hate to call out any one company or business, but this is a really lovely example of a company who had really good intentions, but it didn't work out. So there's a company called Brewdog, and they create beer. And they had a beer which was generated, produced purely by using wind power. And they decided to call this beer Gale, It was a nice play on words. It was power generated by wind, and they thought, we'll call the beer Gale. They had an amazing campaign, very entertaining, very engaging for the customer and consumer, and very clever. But they got called out by their employees for having a toxic workplace environment, which was highly discriminatory. And their employees came out of the woodwork, and a lot was seen on the news and social media about how badly they treated their employees. So it ended up being a very negative thing, something which was hopefully positive, ended up being a very negative thing. And it is off, we have a model to talk about this, how to avoid this kind of thing. And we call this shield, swords and standards. Now, shields and swords is not new, but it's a nice way to think about strategically how we approach sustainability as businesses. The shield is your hygiene factors. You need to make sure that before you go on your offensive with your sword, that you make sure that you've got your own house in order, that your environment, social and governance policies are in order, and that they're watertight. So you're not going to be called out later on because you haven't paid your tax or that you sacked someone unfairly. Those things need to be in place first. You then can go on your offensive play with your thoughts. So what you want to be known as, what you want to be known for, whether that be in the space of environment or social, but it needs to fit under the brand banner, and that's the standard, the banner under which you exist, because it needs to be intuitive to the customer if you're going to have a kind of some form of environmental or social campaign, that it fits with the brand, that it fits with how the brand sits within the category. It needs to be intuitive and make sense to the customer. So this model, this shield, swords and standards, is a really good one to think about how to consider sustainability, both the environmental and the social sustainability. So that was a whistle-stop tour, but I want to finish on the conclusion that I started with at the beginning. If your business isn't sustainable, it isn't sustainable. We need to look after the environment. We need to look after our employees. We need to provide great workplaces, because all things being equal, price, convenience, functionality of products and services, sustainability will win out. Thank you very much.